In the heart of Los Angeles, where power speaks in whispers and respect is measured in silence, Kenji Nakamura sits surrounded by wealth and influence yet remains utterly alone, trapped behind walls of language that no amount of money can tear down. Until a young black waitress named Aria Mitchell, carrying her own secrets and struggles, here's what 20 years of translators could never understand. At 36, Kenji Nakamura commanded the Yamamoto-kai Syndicate's West Coast operations from a glass tower in downtown Los Angeles. But every conversation felt like speaking through fog. His empire stretched from legitimate shipping companies to exclusive nightclubs, from real estate investments to cultural import businesses, all requiring constant communication with American partners who could never quite grasp what he actually meant. The translators spoke his words, but murdered his intentions. The interpreters conveyed information, but lost every nuance that made negotiation an art form. For 3 years since taking control of Los Angeles operations, he had lived in a strange purgatory where his thoughts remained locked inside his mind, filtered through inadequate intermediaries who reduced his complex strategies to crude approximations. Tonight, he sat in the back booth of Sakura Restaurant, one of the few places in the city that understood proper Japanese service, watching his current translator butcher another crucial conversation. The young man spoke textbook Japanese, precise but bloodless, missing every cultural undertone that could make or break a business relationship. Kenji's dark eyes tracked the conversation with growing frustration, his expensive charcoal suit immaculate despite the late hour, his controlled presence a study in restrained power. Sharp features carved from years of calculated decisions remained expressionless, but his hands betrayed tension, long fingers drumming silently against the dark wood table. The restaurant's atmosphere usually calmed him with its authentic touches, the soft lighting and traditional music, the proper spacing between tables that allowed for private conversations. But tonight, even this sanctuary felt contaminated by miscommunication. His business partner, Rodriguez, was explaining territorial boundaries in English, while the translator converted everything into polite, formal Japanese that completely missed the threatening undercurrent of the original message. Kenji understood every word Rodriguez spoke, but protocol demanded he work through official channels, maintaining the careful dance of international business relationships. At 24, Aria Mitchell balanced worn serving trays with the weight of impossible dreams, moving through Sakura Restaurant's dining room with practiced grace that disguised bone-deep exhaustion. Her shift at the upscale establishment was the better of her 2 jobs, where the tips sometimes reached double digits and the customers treated her like a professional rather than an inconvenience. She was tall with natural hair styled in elegant twists that caught the restaurant's soft lighting, her dark skin glowing with health despite the tiredness that lived permanently behind her warm brown eyes. Tonight she carried the same burden she'd shouldered for 2 years, $47,000 in student debt from her linguistics degree at UCLA, money borrowed for dreams that felt increasingly distant with every passing month. The irony wasn't lost on her that she worked in a Japanese restaurant while her degree in Asian languages and literature gathered dust in her studio apartment. She had spent a transformative year in Kyoto, living in a temple, studying formal and colloquial Japanese until she dreamed in kanji characters, until she understood not just words but the spaces between them where true meaning lived. The monks had praised her intuitive grasp of cultural nuance, her ability to hear what wasn't spoken as clearly as what was. But Los Angeles had no patience for cultural sensitivity, and translation jobs required experience she couldn't get without connections she didn't have. Her grandmother's medical bills added another layer of urgency to every decision, diabetes medication and specialist visits that insurance barely covered. Between the restaurant job and weekend shifts at a downtown cafe, Aria scraped together enough to keep them both afloat, but barely. Her dreams of working as a cultural liaison or diplomatic translator felt like luxuries she couldn't afford to pursue, while immediate survival demanded her attention. She moved past the corner booth where the Japanese businessman sat with his associates, catching fragments of conversation that made her footsteps slow involuntarily. The translator was explaining something about shipping schedules, but his Japanese was so formal and stilted that it completely missed the emotional weight behind the English words. She understood immediately what was being lost, how the Americans' frustration and implicit threats were being converted into polite business language that stripped away all urgency and context. Kenji Nakamura noticed everything about his surroundings with the hyper-awareness of someone whose life depended on reading subtle signs, and he caught the waitress's momentary pause as she passed their table. Most staff hurried past conversations conducted in foreign languages, but something about her body language suggested understanding rather than avoidance. Her movements had the fluid confidence of someone completely comfortable in this environment, but her slight hesitation at their table sparked his curiosity. When she returned with water refills, Kenji observed her more carefully. She moved with quiet efficiency, professional but not subservient, meeting his eyes when she asked if they needed anything else. Her English carried no trace of accent, but something about her posture during their conversation suggested she was processing more than just their basic requests. Most Americans grew uncomfortable around extended Japanese conversation, their eyes glazing over with polite indifference. This woman seemed alert, engaged, as if following threads of meaning beyond the translator's interpretation. Rodriguez was growing impatient with the careful diplomatic language, his English becoming more direct and aggressive. "We need to settle this territory question tonight," he said, leaning forward. "Your people either respect our boundaries or we have a problem that nobody wants to handle through lawyers." The translator converted this into a request for clarification about regional business practices, completely defanging the threat while maintaining surface politeness. Aria was clearing plates from the adjacent table when she heard Rodriguez's statement, and her hands stilled for just a moment as she processed the gap between his words and their translation. She understood exactly what was being lost in conversion, how the translator's formal training had left him unable to convey street-level intimidation in culturally appropriate terms. The Japanese businessman would be receiving entirely different information than what was actually being communicated, potentially leading to dangerous miscalculations. Kenji saw her reaction to Rodriguez's statement, the way her shoulders tensed slightly before she resumed her careful table clearing. No one else in the restaurant would have caught that subtle response, but years of reading micro-expressions for survival had sharpened his observation skills. She had understood something significant, something beyond casual eavesdropping. The possibility that this waitress might comprehend Japanese seemed impossible given the setting, but her response suggested knowledge rather than random nervousness. When Rodriguez excused himself for a phone call and the translator stepped away for a moment, Kenji found himself alone at the table, studying the young woman who continued working nearby. She moved through the restaurant with obvious familiarity, knowing exactly which customers preferred immediate attention and which valued privacy. Her interactions with other staff showed easy competence, someone who understood service industry dynamics while maintaining personal dignity. Aria felt his attention like weight against her shoulders, the intensity of focused observation from someone accustomed to command. She had served enough powerful men to recognize the particular quality of assessment that came from those used to making decisions based on incomplete information. Something about his stillness suggested patience combined with calculation, a predator's ability to wait for exactly the right moment to act. When she approached to refill his tea cup, Kenji made his decision. Instead of waiting for his translator's return, he spoke directly in rapid, complex Japanese, his voice low but carrying clearly in the quiet corner of the restaurant. The language flowed like water, formal but warm, asking about her evening and whether she was from Los Angeles originally. The question seemed casual but contained layers of meaning that would test any genuine speaker's ability to parse cultural context. Aria's eyes lifted to meet his, surprise flickering across her features before settling into something like recognition. Without hesitation, she responded in equally fluid Japanese, her pronunciation carrying the precise tonal qualities that could only come from extensive formal training. She explained that she was born in Los Angeles, but had studied in Kyoto, her words flowing with natural rhythm that immediately identified her as someone who had learned the language through immersion rather than textbooks. Kenji's controlled expression cracked for just a moment, genuine shock replacing careful neutrality. In 3 years of conducting business in Los Angeles, No one outside his own organization had addressed him in his native language with such perfect comprehension and cultural awareness. Her response revealed not just linguistic ability, but deep understanding of proper respectful communication patterns, the subtle elements that native speakers learned through childhood but foreigners rarely mastered. The moment stretched between them, weighted with implications neither could fully process immediately. For Kenji, it represented the first genuine communication he had experienced since arriving in America, the possibility of being truly understood rather than approximately translated. For Arya, it opened a door to the professional world she had trained for but never been able to enter, the recognition that her expensive education might finally prove valuable. Rodriguez's return to the table broke the spell, his presence shifting the dynamic back to business formality. But something fundamental had changed in that exchange of understanding, a connection forged through shared language that transcended the careful boundaries of restaurant service. Kenji's dark eyes held new speculation as he watched Arya resume her professional duties, while she moved through the remainder of her shift with heightened awareness of possibilities she had never previously considered. The evening concluded with polite goodbyes and carefully translated diplomatic language, but Kenji remained seated long after his associates departed, drinking slowly cooling tea while processing what he had discovered. 20 years of feeling lost in translation, and the solution had been serving tables 10 feet away. The implications staggered him even as his strategic mind began calculating potential applications for such unexpected linguistic resources. Arya completed her closing duties with unusual distraction, her thoughts returning repeatedly to those moments of perfect understanding, the way genuine communication had felt after years of suppressing her hard-earned skills. She had no context for what the conversation might mean or lead to, but recognition carried its own power. Someone had finally heard what she could actually offer rather than settling for what seemed immediately available. As she prepared to leave for the night, Arya found an envelope discreetly placed near her serving station. Expensive paper containing a business card with elegant Japanese characters alongside English text. Kenji Nakamura, Cultural Import Specialist, with contact information and a brief note written in formal Japanese thanking her for excellent service and expressing hope for future conversations. The card felt substantial in her hands, heavier than paper should be, weighted with possibilities she was afraid to examine too closely. She should throw it away. This connection to a world she understood was dangerous despite its polite veneer. Getting involved with someone who conducted business in quiet corners with nervous translators would be stupid beyond measure. But she slipped the card into her pocket anyway, drawn by the memory of being truly heard for the first time in years, the intoxicating feeling of using skills she had worked so hard to develop. 3 days passed before Kenji Nakamura returned to Sakura Restaurant, but Arya Mitchell had thought about their brief exchange every night since. She told herself it meant nothing, that powerful men made casual conversation all the time without deeper implications, but her fingers kept finding the business card in her pocket, tracing the raised lettering of his name. Tonight he entered alone, no associates or translators trailing behind him, his expensive black suit perfectly tailored despite the late Tuesday evening hour when the restaurant was nearly empty. He requested her section specifically, settling into the same corner booth with the controlled presence that made other diners instinctively lower their voices. Arya approached with professional composure, but her pulse quickened when his dark eyes met hers with unmistakable recognition. This time there would be no pretense of casual interaction, no buffer of business associates to maintain safe distance. Whatever test was coming, she would face it directly. Kenji spoke immediately in rapid, complex Japanese, his words flowing with the intricate grammatical structures that separated fluent speakers from textbook students. He ordered not just food but specific preparations that required understanding of seasonal ingredients, regional preferences, and cultural significance of presentation. His language carried layers of meaning, testing her comprehension of formal honorifics, while weaving in colloquial expressions that would trip up anyone who had learned Japanese purely through academic study. Arya responded without hesitation, her voice carrying the precise tonal qualities that marked genuine fluency. She confirmed his order using appropriate respectful language, while adding observations about the chef's particular expertise with autumn preparations. Her pronunciation was flawless, but more importantly, she understood the cultural weight behind his word choices, responding with the exact level of formality that acknowledged his status while maintaining her own dignity as someone who deserved respect. Kenji's carefully controlled expression shifted almost imperceptibly, genuine surprise breaking through practiced neutrality. In 3 years of conducting business in Los Angeles, surrounded by translators and cultural consultants who claimed expertise, no one had demonstrated this level of authentic understanding. She wasn't just speaking Japanese, she was thinking in it, processing not just vocabulary but the complex social dynamics that determined appropriate communication patterns. When she returned with his tea, prepared exactly as he had specified with attention to details that proved her cultural knowledge, Kenji made his decision. This conversation would reveal whether last week's brief exchange had been lucky coincidence or evidence of skills that could transform his entire operation. He began speaking about his business challenges, describing the constant frustration of working through intermediaries who reduced his precise thoughts to crude approximations. Arya listened with the focused attention of someone who understood exactly what he was describing. Her year in Kyoto had taught her that language was about far more than vocabulary and grammar, that true communication required understanding the spaces between words where actual meaning lived. She had watched American students struggle with concepts that couldn't be directly translated, missing entire layers of significance because they approached Japanese as a code to be cracked rather than a culture to be absorbed. She shared carefully selected details about her own experience, describing how the monks in Kyoto had taught her to hear the emotional undertones that shaped every conversation. They had insisted that language without cultural context was like music without rhythm, technically correct, but missing the elements that created genuine understanding. Her training had included formal business Japanese, street slang, religious terminology, and the subtle variations that indicated regional origins and social status. Kenji found himself speaking more freely than he had in years, expressing frustrations about American business culture that he had never been able to articulate through translators. The relief of being genuinely understood was intoxicating, like stepping from a soundproof room into clear air. For the first time since arriving in Los Angeles, he could communicate complex ideas without watching them get filtered through inadequate interpretation. As their conversation deepened, Kenji began formulating a plan that would test her abilities under real pressure. His organization was facing territorial challenges from a Chinese syndicate led by Waitress, a man who spoke multiple languages fluently and used that advantage to manipulate negotiations. Tomorrow's meeting would determine whether current boundaries held or violence became inevitable. The success of that negotiation could depend entirely on precise communication, understanding not just what was said, but what was meant. The decision crystallized as he watched Arya process his explanation of the territorial dispute with immediate comprehension. She understood the cultural implications, the way saving face would influence every aspect of the discussion, the critical importance of finding language that allowed both sides to maintain dignity while establishing clear boundaries. Her questions revealed strategic thinking that went far beyond simple translation skills. When he made his proposal, Arya felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Kenji wanted her to attend tomorrow's meeting as a cultural consultant, someone who could ensure that nothing was lost in translation when stakes were highest. The fee he offered was more than she made in 3 months at the restaurant, enough to make a real dent in her student loans, but the request carried implications that frightened her even as it excited her. She could see the danger in getting involved with someone whose business required such careful negotiation, whose casual mention of territorial disputes suggested activities beyond legitimate commerce. But she could also see the professional opportunity she had dreamed about, the chance to use her expensive education for something meaningful rather than carrying serving trays indefinitely. The monks in Kyoto had taught her that language was a bridge between worlds, and Kenji was offering her the chance to build bridges that could prevent conflict rather than escalate it. Her acceptance came after only brief hesitation, the practical need for money combining with genuine fascination at the prospect of high-stakes interpretation. Kenji's satisfaction was evident in the slight relaxation of his rigid posture, the first time she had seen him display any emotional response beyond controlled observation. He provided an address for tomorrow's meeting, explaining that she should dress professionally and prepare for conversation that might shift rapidly between formal business language and street-level intimidation. The next evening found Arya standing outside an upscale office building in Century City, her best business suit pressed and her hair styled in a conservative twist that projected competence and discretion. The lobby was all marble and understated luxury, the kind of place where million-dollar deals were concluded with handshakes and where appearance mattered as much as credentials. Kenji met her at the elevator, his presence commanding immediate attention from building security, who clearly knew exactly who he was. The conference room on the 15th floor overlooked the city lights, floor-to-ceiling windows creating an atmosphere of elevation and power. Wei Chun had already arrived with 2 associates, his expensive clothing and confident bearing immediately marking him as someone accustomed to getting his way through intelligence and intimidation. The Chinese syndicate leader was younger than Kenji, perhaps early 30s, with sharp features and calculating eyes that missed nothing about the room's occupants. Introductions were handled carefully, each side acknowledging the other's presence without conceding any advantage. Arya was presented simply as a cultural consultant, her credentials mentioned briefly, but her specific role left deliberately ambiguous. Wei Chun studied her with obvious curiosity, his expression suggesting surprise at finding someone unexpected in what should have been a predictable business meeting. The initial conversation proceeded smoothly, both sides using diplomatic language to outline their positions while avoiding direct confrontation. Territory boundaries were discussed in abstract terms, market opportunities explored with careful attention to mutual benefit. But Arya could hear the tension underneath the polite words, the way each side was testing the other's commitment to peaceful resolution while preparing for alternatives if negotiation failed. The crisis emerged when Wei Chun's translator made a critical error, converting a subtle threat into a direct insult that struck at the heart of cultural honor codes that governed both organizations. The Chinese leader's face darkened with anger as he heard what he believed was deliberate disrespect, while Kenji's controlled stillness suggested barely contained violence at what seemed like intentional provocation. Arya understood immediately what had gone wrong, how the translator's inadequate grasp of cultural nuance had turned careful positioning into mortal offense. Both leaders were preparing to abandon diplomacy for more direct methods of communication, their body language shifting toward confrontation that could escalate beyond words. The moment balanced on a knife's edge, with violence becoming inevitable unless someone could restore understanding. Without waiting for permission, Arya stepped into the conversation with precise Japanese that acknowledged the translation error while providing accurate interpretation of the original Chinese statement. Her words carried the exact level of formality required to address both leaders with appropriate respect while clarifying that no insult had been intended. She spoke with quiet authority, someone who understood exactly what was at stake and how to defuse tension without making either side lose face. The effect was immediate and profound. Wei Chun's anger shifted to surprise as he realized that someone in the room actually understood the cultural dynamics that governed their interaction. Kenji's dark eyes reflected amazement at hearing his thoughts translated with perfect accuracy for the first time in years. The tension that had been building toward violence dissipated as both sides recognized that genuine communication was finally possible. What followed was 30 minutes of the most productive negotiation either leader had experienced in Los Angeles. With Arya facilitating precise translation that preserved cultural context, both sides could express their actual positions rather than sanitized approximations. Territory boundaries were established with clarity that prevented future misunderstanding, while business opportunities were identified that served mutual interests rather than zero-sum competition. The meeting concluded with respectful acknowledgement from both sides, handshakes that carried genuine agreement rather than temporary truce. But as the Chinese delegation prepared to leave, Wei Chun's parting words carried unmistakable threat. His translator was excellent, he said in perfect English, but perhaps too effective for ongoing business relationships. Organizations that gained unfair advantages through superior communication might find that advantage challenged through other methods. Kenji understood the implication immediately, his jaw tightening as he processed the warning directed at Arya. Wei Chun was acknowledging her value while simultaneously marking her as a target for elimination. The Chinese leader had identified her as the source of Japanese negotiating advantage and would move to remove that advantage before future meetings. The casual threat was delivered with diplomatic language, but its meaning was clear to everyone in the room. As they left the building, Kenji's mind was already calculating protection requirements and threat assessment protocols. He had found exactly what his organization needed, someone who could bridge cultural gaps that had hampered operations for years. But that discovery had also painted a target on her back, marking her for elimination by rivals who would never allow such an advantage to remain in Japanese hands. Arya felt the weight of those implications settling around her shoulders like a cold blanket. The professional opportunity she had dreamed about came with dangers she had never considered, connections to a world where superior skills could make someone a target for violence rather than advancement. But she had also experienced the intoxicating rush of using her abilities at the highest level, of preventing conflict through precise understanding rather than watching miscommunication escalate toward disaster. The car ride back to her apartment passed in thoughtful silence, both of them processing what the evening's success would cost in terms of ongoing security and commitment. Kenji was already planning protective measures while calculating how to integrate her skills into long-term operations. Arya was weighing professional fulfillment against personal safety, wondering if the chance to build bridges between cultures was worth the risk of being targeted for destruction by those who preferred miscommunication and chaos. When he walked her to her door, Kenji's parting words carried both gratitude and warning. Tonight had proven her value beyond question, but it had also demonstrated the prices that came with excellence in his world. Tomorrow would bring decisions about how deeply she was willing to commit to opportunities that could transform her life while potentially ending it. The business card in her pocket no longer felt like simple possibility, but like a contract written in languages that only some people were qualified to read. Arya Mitchell discovered the first threatening message when she returned home at midnight. Chinese characters spray-painted across her apartment door in blood-red paint that was still wet enough to drip onto the hallway carpet. She didn't need translation to understand the basic sentiment, but the specific language was crude and direct, promising violence that would be both personal and prolonged. Her hands shook as she fumbled with her keys, the weight of Wei Chen's parting words from the business meeting suddenly carrying new and terrifying significance. The vandalism was just the beginning. Over the next 3 days, Arya lived in a state of constant vigilance that exhausted her beyond any physical labor. Her car tires were slashed while she worked her afternoon shift at the downtown cafe. Strange men appeared outside her grandmother's medical appointments, taking photographs with expensive cameras before disappearing into traffic. Her cell phone received calls at all hours, voices speaking rapid Chinese that she couldn't understand, but whose threatening tone required no translation. The breaking point came on Thursday evening when she found her apartment door standing open, the lock expertly picked and her modest belongings scattered with methodical precision. Nothing was stolen, but everything was touched, violated, rearranged to demonstrate how easily her private space could be invaded. A single origami crane sat on her pillow, folded from paper that carried a message in elegant Chinese calligraphy. This time she understood enough characters to grasp the essential meaning. Stop helping the Japanese or face consequences that would extend to everyone she loved. Arya sat on her violated bed, staring at the crane while her mind calculated options that grew more limited with each passing hour. She could go to the police, but what could they do about threats from people who had made no direct contact and left no evidence beyond vandalism and intimidation? She could quit her job at the restaurant and hope Wei Chen's attention would shift elsewhere, but the meeting had already happened, the damage already done. She had proven too useful to Kenji's organization and too dangerous to Wei Chen's interests. Her grandmother's safety consumed her thoughts as she tried to plan next steps that would protect them both. The elderly woman lived alone in a senior community across town, relying on Arya for transportation to medical appointments and grocery shopping. If these people were willing to threaten an innocent old woman to pressure her granddaughter, no distance would provide adequate protection. Running would only delay the inevitable, while potentially making the eventual confrontation more violent. The decision was taken from her when she heard footsteps in the hallway outside her damaged apartment, multiple sets moving with coordinated precision that suggested professional training rather than random criminals. Aria's heart hammered against her ribs as she realized that whoever was approaching had come to finish what the psychological intimidation had started. She was trapped in a violated space with no exit strategy and no way to call for help that would arrive in time. The soft knock on her broken door came as a surprise, followed by Kenji Nakamura's voice speaking her name in careful, controlled Japanese. Relief flooded through her as she recognized the sound of rescue, even as her rational mind wondered how he had known to find her at exactly the moment when his protection became essential. When she opened the door, Kenji stood in her hallway with 3 associates whose expensive clothing couldn't disguise the predatory alertness that marked professional enforcers. His dark eyes took in the devastation of her apartment with a single comprehensive glance, cataloging evidence of intrusion while calculating threat levels and response requirements. The controlled fury in his expression was more frightening than any emotional outburst, the cold anger of someone who considered this attack a personal insult that demanded permanent resolution. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question or delay. The situation was worse than she understood, Kenji explained in rapid Japanese that conveyed both urgency and absolute confidence in his assessment. Wei-chen's people had marked her for elimination, not just intimidation, and tonight's apartment invasion was reconnaissance for tomorrow's more direct action. The Chinese syndicate leader had decided that removing her would restore the communication advantage his organization required for future territorial expansion. Within minutes, Aria found herself in the back seat of an armored sedan that moved through Los Angeles traffic with the smooth efficiency of a vehicle whose driver knew exactly where potential threats might emerge. The city lights blurred past windows that she suspected were bulletproof, while Kenji spoke quietly into a secure phone in Japanese too rapid and technical for her to follow completely. She caught references to security protocols, perimeter establishment, and permanent solutions that suggested Wei-chen would not have another opportunity to threaten anyone under Yamamoto-kai protection. The compound they approached through electronic gates and multiple security checkpoints was unlike anything Aria had expected from someone in Kenji's profession. Traditional Japanese architecture blended seamlessly with state-of-the-art security systems, creating an environment that felt both culturally authentic and impenetrable to outside threats. Carefully maintained gardens surrounded buildings constructed with the clean lines and natural materials that characterized classical design, while discrete cameras and sensors created invisible barriers that monitored every approaching footstep. Kenji led her through the main residence, a structure that demonstrated how unlimited resources could preserve cultural heritage while accommodating modern security requirements. Sliding doors opened onto rooms furnished with tatami mats and low tables, where traditional art shared wall space with monitors displaying feeds from cameras positioned throughout the property. The atmosphere was peaceful yet alert, a sanctuary maintained by constant vigilance rather than isolation from potential threats. They settled in his private office, a room that balanced Eastern aesthetics with Western business functionality, where floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked gardens illuminated by subtle lighting that created beauty while preventing concealment of potential intruders. Kenji prepared tea with the precise movements of someone who found ceremony calming, his hands steady despite the evening's crisis as he measured leaves and monitored water temperature with meditative focus. When he began outlining his proposal, Aria realized that tonight's rescue had been the opening move in a much larger game of strategic positioning. Kenji had been planning this conversation since their first meeting at the restaurant, calculating exactly how to present terms that would seem reasonable under circumstances that made refusal impossible. His offer was comprehensive and specific, designed to address every aspect of her current situation while binding her to his organization permanently. $150,000 annually, paid monthly with bonuses for exceptional service during high-stakes negotiations. Full funding for a master's degree in international relations with a focus on East Asian studies. including living expenses and research travel to Japan for thesis work that would enhance her cultural expertise. Complete medical coverage for both her and her grandmother, including experimental treatments not covered by traditional insurance, with access to specialists whose services were normally reserved for heads of state and corporate executives. Her role would be cultural liaison and senior translator, responsible for ensuring that nothing was lost in communication between his organization and American business partners, law enforcement, government officials, and rival syndicates whose territorial agreements required constant renegotiation. She would attend all major meetings, review important documents before translation, and provide cultural context that could prevent misunderstandings from escalating into violence. Her insights would inform strategic decisions about expansion, alliance building, and conflict resolution that affected operations across the entire West Coast. The terms were explicit and non-negotiable. She would live on the compound in a private apartment designed to accommodate her cultural preferences and professional requirements, with access to a library of linguistic resources and secure communication equipment that would allow her to consult with academic experts when complex translation challenges arose. Absolute loyalty meant that information learned through her position would never be shared with outside parties, whether law enforcement, rival organizations, or academic colleagues who might be researching similar topics. Complete discretion required that her employment remain invisible to anyone who might use knowledge of her role to compromise operations or target her for elimination. Availability 24 hours per day meant that urgent translation requirements took priority over personal plans, sleep schedules, and social commitments that might conflict with organizational needs during crisis situations. Arya listened to the formal presentation with growing understanding of the golden cage being constructed around her dreams and necessities. The financial terms were more than she had imagined possible, enough to transform her life and secure her grandmother's care, while providing educational opportunities that could establish her as a recognized expert in cross-cultural communication. But the personal costs were equally clear: the isolation from normal social relationships, and the moral compromises that would be required to maintain loyalty to an organization whose methods she couldn't fully endorse. Her objections came carefully, voiced in Japanese that acknowledged his authority while asserting her own dignity and concerns. Independence had always been her highest priority, the freedom to make choices based on personal values rather than external pressure or financial necessity. Working for a criminal organization, no matter how cultured or restrained, would require her to participate in activities that violated principles she had maintained despite years of struggle and poverty. The cultural preservation he offered sounded like erasure of her American identity, immersion so complete that she might lose touch with the community and relationships that had sustained her through difficult years. Living on a protected compound would mean accepting a kind of imprisonment, however luxurious, that separated her from the normal world of friendships, dating, and personal growth that had nothing to do with professional obligations. Kenji's response demonstrated why he had survived and prospered in a business that destroyed men who made decisions based on emotion rather than strategic calculation. He acknowledged her concerns with respect, while systematically dismantling each objection with facts that made her alternatives appear increasingly unrealistic. Independence was a luxury that required safety, and Wei Chun had already demonstrated that her safety no longer existed outside of Yamamoto-kai protection. The moral concerns about criminal activity reflected assumptions based on Hollywood fantasies rather than business realities, Kenji explained with patient precision. His organization operated multiple legitimate enterprises that required constant negotiation with government officials, union representatives, and corporate executives whose cultural ignorance created barriers to profitable cooperation. The translation work she would perform was primarily for legal business activities that happened to be conducted by people whose other interests sometimes violated American law. Cultural preservation meant maintaining connection to traditions that risked disappearing in the face of American homogenization, not abandoning her heritage, but expanding it to include skills and knowledge that would make her invaluable in an increasingly globalized economy. The compound wasn't a prison but a sanctuary where she could develop expertise without the constant financial pressure that had forced her to waste her talents serving food instead of facilitating understanding between cultures. As for personal relationships, Kenji observed with slightly raised eyebrow. Her current social life consisted mainly of exhausted conversations with co-workers who had no interest in her academic achievements or cultural insights. The isolation she feared was already her reality, the difference being that his offer provided intellectual stimulation and professional respect, instead of minimum wage servitude that would never allow her to achieve anything meaningful. Arya felt the weight of truth in his assessment, the recognition that her alternatives had always been limited and were now approaching non-existent. The apartment invasion had proven that returning to her previous life was impossible, while running would mean abandoning her grandmother and accepting poverty that made education permanently unaffordable. She could refuse his offer and face Wei Chen's organization with resources that consisted of $47,000 in debt and a part-time job that paid barely enough for survival. The internal debate played out in silence as she weighed freedom against security, principles against pragmatism, dreams against current reality. Her grandmother's medical needs provided stark context for abstract moral concerns, while the opportunity to use her linguistic training at the highest level offered professional fulfillment she had never imagined possible. The golden cage Kenji described was still a cage, but it was also the only path toward achieving goals that had seemed permanently out of reach. Her acceptance came with negotiated modifications that preserved some illusion of personal autonomy. Weekly visits to her grandmother without security escorts, as long as threat levels remained manageable, and the elderly woman agreed to relocate to a safer neighborhood that Yamamoto-kai resources would provide. Access to academic conferences where she could maintain connections with former professors and linguistic researchers, subject to security review and advance approval for any papers or presentations that might reference her professional experiences. Kenji's satisfaction was evident in the slight relaxation of his formal posture, the first genuine smile she had seen from him since their initial conversation at the restaurant. He produced documents that formalized their agreement, contracts written in both English and Japanese that spelled out exactly what each party was promising and what consequences would follow violations of trust or loyalty. The papers felt substantial in her hands, heavier than mere legal agreements, weighted with the recognition that she was signing away one life to begin another. The integration process began immediately, with Kenji's security chief explaining compound protocols while housekeeping staff prepared her new apartment with furnishings that balanced Western comfort with Eastern aesthetics. Her personal belongings were retrieved from her violated former residence by professionals who cataloged everything for potential security risks while ensuring that sentimental items and essential documents survived the transition to protected status. Within 48 hours, Arya found herself established in quarters that were larger and more comfortable than anywhere she had ever lived, surrounded by books in multiple languages and electronic equipment that connected her to translation databases used by international corporations and diplomatic services. Her first professional assignment involved reviewing contracts for a shipping company that moved legitimate cargo while ensuring that customs inspections remained superficial and non-intrusive. The work was intellectually challenging in ways that restaurant service had never approached, requiring her to understand legal terminology in 3 languages while preserving nuanced meanings that could affect multi-million-dollar business relationships. For the first time since graduating from UCLA, Arya was using skills that had cost her thousands of dollars in years of study, solving problems that required both linguistic expertise and cultural insight. Her grandmother's reaction to the apartment upgrade and improved medical coverage was worth whatever personal freedom Arya had sacrificed. The elderly woman's relief at having professional nursing care and access to specialists providing validation that practical decisions sometimes outweighed abstract principles. The weekly visits maintained connection to her previous life, while demonstrating how much that life had improved through choices that couldn't be undone but didn't need to be regretted. As her first month in the compound drew to a close, Arya began to understand that Kenji had been right about the nature of isolation and belonging. The intellectual stimulation of complex translation work provided satisfaction that had been missing from her previous existence, while the respect accorded to her professional expertise created a sense of value that tip-dependent service jobs had never offered. She was building bridges between cultures rather than simply surviving until something better might eventually appear. The golden cage felt less restrictive as its benefits became apparent. The security it provided allowing her to focus on developing skills rather than worrying about rent payments and debt collection calls. Whatever moral compromises her position required were balanced by the knowledge that her work prevented misunderstandings that could escalate into violence. That precise communication served peace even when conducted by people whose other activities sometimes required more direct methods of conflict resolution. 3 months after accepting Kenji Nakamura's protection and employment, Arya Mitchell had transformed his organization's communication capabilities in ways that surprised even her most optimistic expectations. Business relationships that had struggled with persistent misunderstandings now operated with smooth efficiency, while contract negotiations that previously required multiple rounds of clarification were resolved in single meetings where precise translation eliminated ambiguity and cultural confusion. The compound had become her world in ways both expected and surprising, the protected environment providing intellectual stimulation that made her previous life feel small and constrained by comparison. Her daily routine involved reviewing documents that affected operations across multiple states, facilitating conference calls with partners whose cultural backgrounds required careful attention to communication protocols, and attending meetings where her translations could determine whether business relationships flourished or deteriorated into expensive conflicts. Kenji had dropped the formal distance that characterized their early interactions, speaking to her exclusively in Japanese with a casualness that revealed personality traits hidden beneath professional necessity. His dry sense of humor emerged during long working sessions, while his appreciation for cultural subtlety created conversations that ranged from classical poetry to contemporary film with equal engagement and insight. The controlled intensity that marked his public presence softened into something more accessible when they worked alone, reviewing contracts or planning negotiation strategies that required both linguistic precision and strategic thinking. Their morning meetings had evolved into informal tea ceremonies conducted in the traditional room that Kenji had designed specifically for cultural practices that connected him to heritage and identity. He prepared the tea with meditative focus that calmed both participants, his precise movements creating rhythm and meaning that transcended simple beverage preparation. These sessions provided space for discussions that went beyond immediate business requirements. Explorations of language and culture that fed intellectual hunger neither had previously been able to satisfy. The staff noticed changes in Kenji's behavior that were subtle but significant to people trained to read emotional states and stress levels in their employer. His decisions came more quickly and with greater confidence, while his interactions with subordinates carried less underlying tension than had characterized his leadership during years of communication frustration. The chronic irritation that had marked his dealings with inadequate translators had disappeared, replaced by the satisfaction of someone whose thoughts were finally being understood and accurately conveyed to others. Arya found herself looking forward to their working sessions with anticipation that went beyond professional interest, drawn by intellectual compatibility that had been missing from every relationship in her adult life. Kenji challenged her understanding of linguistic nuance while respecting expertise that had taken years to develop, creating collaborative problem-solving that utilized both participants' strengths without diminishing either person's contributions. Their conversations flowed with natural rhythm that made hours pass unnoticed, shared fascination with cultural complexity, creating connection that felt both professional and deeply personal. The evening that changed everything began with Kenji's invitation to join him for dinner in his private residence, a traditional structure within the compound that reflected personal taste rather than business requirements. The building was smaller and more intimate than the conference facilities where they usually worked, designed around principles of harmony and simplicity that created atmosphere conducive to reflection rather than negotiation. Sliding doors opened onto gardens illuminated by lanterns that cast gentle light over carefully maintained plants and stone arrangements that encouraged contemplation. He had prepared the meal himself, demonstrating culinary skills that surprised Arya despite her growing understanding of his multifaceted personality. The food was elegant but not ostentatious, seasonal ingredients prepared with techniques that honored traditional methods while accommodating personal preferences. They sat on cushions at a low table that encouraged relaxed conversation, the formal barriers of business meetings replaced by domestic comfort that felt both foreign and familiar. As they shared sake that had been aged for 15 years, Kenji began speaking about cultural identity in ways that revealed vulnerabilities he had never previously expressed. The alcohol loosened restraints that normally kept personal history separate from professional relationships, while the intimate setting created space for admissions that would have been impossible in more formal environments. His words carried weight accumulated over decades of isolation. Thoughts that had been carefully contained finally finding expression through someone capable of understanding their full meaning. He described arriving in Los Angeles at 16 after family disgrace that made remaining in Japan impossible, thrust into a culture whose language he spoke poorly and whose social dynamics he understood even less. The Yakuza connections that provided survival opportunities also created isolation from mainstream American society, marking him as permanently foreign regardless of how many years he spent learning local customs and business practices. Success had brought wealth and power but not belonging, respect but not understanding, compliance but not genuine communication. 20 years of feeling lost in translation had created a kind of emotional imprisonment that wealth and status couldn't alleviate. Kenji explained with quiet intensity that revealed depth of frustration she had never suspected. Every important conversation filtered through intermediaries who reduced complex thoughts to simplified approximations. Every negotiation hampered by cultural misunderstandings that could have been avoided if direct communication had been possible. He had built an empire while feeling like a stranger in his own life, surrounded by people who obeyed his orders but never truly heard what he was trying to say. The admission came with vulnerability that transformed her understanding of their relationship dynamics, revealing that she provided something more essential than professional services. "You are the first person who hears what I actually say," he told her in Japanese that carried emotional weight impossible to convey through translation. "Not what they think I mean, not what they assume I want, but what I am actually trying to communicate. For the first time in 20 years, I can think in my native language and know that my thoughts will be understood exactly as I intend them." Arya felt her heart shifting in ways that had nothing to do with professional gratitude or financial security. Recognition that their connection transcended employment relationships despite the formal contracts that defined their association. She shared her own experiences of cultural displacement, the sense of being caught between worlds that had characterized her entire academic career. Her year in Kyoto had felt like coming home to a heritage that wasn't technically hers, while returning to Los Angeles had created awareness of how American culture could feel foreign and limiting to someone whose mind had been expanded by different ways of organizing reality. They talked through the night about identity and belonging, about the ways language shaped thought, and how cultural context created meaning that couldn't be preserved through simple translation. Kenji described feeling disconnected from his own emotions when forced to express them through English, while Arya explained how her academic training had created intellectual isolation from peers who saw her linguistic interests as exotic hobbies rather than serious professional preparation. The growing attraction between them became impossible to ignore as conversation revealed compatible minds and shared experiences that created intimacy more profound than physical desire. But both recognized the complications that romantic involvement would create, the way personal relationships could compromise professional effectiveness while potentially destabilizing security arrangements that protected them both. The tension remained unresolved but acknowledged, adding emotional weight to working partnerships that had already become the most important relationship in both their lives. As dawn approached, their conversation was interrupted by urgent communication from Kenji's security chief, electronic surveillance having detected unusual activity around the compound perimeter that suggested professional reconnaissance rather than random criminal interest. Camera feeds showed vehicles with modified license plates conducting systematic observation of entry points and security measures, the kind of careful preparation that preceded major operations against heavily defended targets. The threat assessment revealed information that confirmed Aria's worst fears about the long-term consequences of her effectiveness as Kenji's translator and cultural liaison. Wei Chun had recruited a team of Japanese-speaking operatives, former self-defense force members whose linguistic abilities and military training made them capable of penetrating security that assumed language barriers would prevent sophisticated infiltration attempts. The Chinese syndicate leader had decided that eliminating Kenji's communication advantage required more direct methods than intimidation and psychological pressure. Intelligence gathered through electronic intercepts indicated that the new operatives understood enough Japanese to monitor radio communications between security teams, potentially compromising protocols that had previously provided adequate protection through linguistic obscurity. Wei Chun was planning to use cultural and linguistic knowledge as weapons, turning Kenji's own heritage against him while demonstrating that no advantage could be maintained permanently in a business where survival required constant adaptation to evolving threats. The implications were sobering for both Kenji and Aria. Recognition that her value to his organization had made her a target for elimination by enemies who would never allow such strategic advantages to remain in rival hands. But the night's conversation had also revealed that their connection went far beyond professional utility, that they provided each other with understanding and acceptance that neither had found elsewhere despite years of searching for genuine communication and cultural validation. Kenji's response to the new threat was characteristically methodical, his strategic mind already calculating security upgrades and operational modifications that would neutralize linguistic advantages while maintaining effectiveness of his organization's communication systems. But his personal response revealed how much Aria's presence had come to mean beyond her professional contributions, the way she had become essential to his emotional well-being rather than simply useful for business operations. As morning light filtered through the traditional windows of his private residence, Kenji made commitments that went beyond employment contracts and protection arrangements. Whatever measures were required to ensure Aria's safety would be implemented regardless of cost or complexity, while her role in his organization would be expanded to include cultural preservation activities that served personal as well as professional purposes. She had become too important to risk losing, too valuable to treat as merely another employee whose services could be replaced if circumstances required organizational restructuring. Aria's acceptance of these deeper commitments came with full understanding of what they implied about her future and the choices that would define her relationship with both Kenji and the dangerous world he inhabited. Professional partnership was evolving into something more complex and binding, connection that transcended cultural boundaries while requiring both participants to navigate moral ambiguities that couldn't be resolved through simple ethical guidelines. The morning found them planning security modifications that would protect not just business operations, but the personal relationship that had become central to both their lives. Recognition that cultural understanding and emotional intimacy were worth defending against enemies who sought to destroy anything that provided competitive advantages to rival organizations. Their shared commitment to preserving what they had built together would be tested by challenges that threatened not just their safety, but their ability to maintain the trust and communication that had transformed professional necessity into something approaching love. Wei Chun's new strategy represented more than territorial dispute or business rivalry. Aria realized as she reviewed intelligence reports that detailed the scope of threats facing anyone who provided linguistic advantages to Yamamoto-kai operations. The Chinese leader was targeting the foundation of communication that made their relationship possible, seeking to eliminate not just professional capabilities, but personal connections that transcended organizational boundaries. The battle for cultural understanding had become personal, with stakes that went far beyond business success or territorial control. The compound's enhanced security measures would provide physical protection, but preserving the trust and intimacy they had developed would require vigilance that extended beyond electronic surveillance and armed guards. Their enemies understood that destroying communication was more effective than direct violence, that isolation could accomplish what bullets and intimidation had failed to achieve. The defense of their relationship would test everything they had learned about each other during months of building professional partnership into something deeper and more lasting. as they prepared for challenges that would determine whether cultural understanding could survive in a world where difference was seen as weakness to be exploited rather than strength to be preserved. Both Kenji and Arya recognized that their connection had become worth fighting for regardless of personal costs or professional risks. What had begun as employment arrangement had evolved into partnership that served needs neither had fully understood until finding someone capable of providing the understanding and acceptance they had sought throughout their adult lives. The intercepted communication arrived through channels that Kenji Nakamura's organization had considered absolutely secure, encrypted messages between Wei Chen's operatives that revealed detailed knowledge of Yamamoto-kai security protocols, meeting schedules, and operational procedures that should have been known only to trusted inner circle members. The intelligence was devastating in its precision, showing that someone with highest-level access had been feeding information to Chinese rivals for weeks, possibly months, compromising operations while placing everyone in the organization at risk of elimination. Kenji stared at the decoded transcripts in his private office, his controlled expression masking fury that threatened to overwhelm strategic thinking necessary for damage assessment and response planning. The betrayal cut deeper than simple business rivalry, representing violation of trust that formed the foundation of organizational survival in a world where loyalty meant the difference between prosperity and violent death. Someone who had shared meals at his table, participated in decision-making processes, and witnessed his most vulnerable moments had been selling information to enemies who would use that knowledge to destroy everything he had built. The evidence pointed in directions that made his chest tighten with possibilities he didn't want to consider but couldn't ignore as Security Chief Yamato spread documents across the conference table with methodical precision. Communication intercepts showed that Wei Chen's people possessed intimate knowledge of compound layout, staff schedules, and security rotation patterns that only someone with daily access could have provided. The timing of information transfers corresponded exactly with periods when sensitive meetings had been conducted, including discussions of territorial agreements and business partnerships that affected operations across the entire West Coast. Most damning was the linguistic analysis that revealed their informant understood not just English, but Japanese cultural nuances that allowed for accurate interpretation of overheard conversations conducted in Kenji's native language. The precision of translated intelligence suggested someone with advanced linguistic training rather than simple business knowledge, someone capable of understanding not just words, but cultural context that shaped their actual meaning. The description matched exactly one person in the organization whose skills made such detailed comprehension possible. Arya Mitchell had been present at every meeting where compromised information was discussed, her role as cultural liaison providing perfect cover for intelligence gathering, while her linguistic abilities allowed her to understand conversations that other staff members couldn't follow. Her sudden appearance in his life, the convenient timing of her language skills, and her immediate integration into the most sensitive aspects of organizational operations created a pattern that security protocols demanded be investigated regardless of personal feelings or professional relationships. The possibility that she was a plant, recruited by Wei Chen specifically to infiltrate his organization through manufactured linguistic credentials and fabricated personal history, explained too many coincidences to be dismissed without thorough investigation. Her financial desperation had made her vulnerable to recruitment, while her academic background provided perfect preparation for long-term intelligence operations that required cultural authenticity and linguistic precision. The monks in Kyoto could have been covers for intelligence training. Her grandmother's medical needs manufactured leverage to ensure cooperation with handlers who demanded absolute loyalty to mission objectives. Kenji felt something dying inside his chest as he forced himself to examine evidence that threatened to destroy the most meaningful relationship he had developed since arriving in America. Professional paranoia warred with personal conviction that the woman who had shared his most intimate thoughts couldn't possibly be working for enemies who sought his destruction. But survival in his world required prioritizing organizational security over individual emotions, making decisions based on evidence rather than wishful thinking about people whose motivations might not be what they appeared. The confrontation took place in the same traditional room, where they had shared tea ceremonies and cultural discussions that revealed vulnerabilities he had never expressed to another person. Now that space felt contaminated by suspicion that poisoned memories of connection and understanding, transforming intimate moments into potential intelligence-gathering operations that had been calculated for maximum emotional impact and information extraction. Kenji's voice carried none of the warmth that had characterized their recent interactions, formal Japanese creating distance that felt like physical barriers being erected between them. Aria's shock at being accused of betrayal was either genuine or brilliantly performed, her response in flawless Japanese carrying emotional weight that seemed impossible to fake, but that professional training could potentially simulate with devastating effectiveness. Her denials were passionate and detailed, providing explanations for her presence at sensitive meetings and offering to submit to any investigation that would prove her loyalty to the organization and to him personally. But evidence was evidence, and patterns were patterns, regardless of how convincing emotional responses might appear to someone whose judgment was compromised by feelings that had no place in security assessments. The formal investigation that followed was thorough and humiliating. Every aspect of Aria's life since joining the organization subjected to scrutiny that revealed exactly how much access she had been given and how that access could have been exploited for intelligence purposes. Her apartment was searched for communication devices and hidden recording equipment, her personal electronics analyzed for evidence of unauthorized contact with outside parties, her academic credentials verified through channels that confirmed their authenticity while revealing nothing about potential recruitment during her time in Kyoto. Communication between them ceased except for essential business requirements. The easy intimacy that had developed over months replaced by professional formality that felt like death of everything meaningful they had built together. Aria completed translation assignments with mechanical precision while avoiding eye contact that might reveal either guilt or hurt feelings that could indicate innocence. Kenji conducted meetings with cold efficiency that masked emotional devastation worse than any business setback or territorial dispute he had previously endured. The breakthrough came when enhanced surveillance detected unauthorized electronic activity from a section of the compound where Aria had never been granted access. Hidden communication equipment broadcasting encrypted messages during periods when she was attending language classes or visiting her grandmother under escort. Security teams traced the signals to equipment concealed in quarters occupied by Takashi Yamamoto, a logistics coordinator who had worked for the organization for 8 years and whose loyalty had never been questioned because of his family connections to founding members and his apparent lack of linguistic skills necessary for intelligence operations. Investigation revealed that Takashi had been recruited through family leverage that Wei Chen's operatives had discovered during careful background research, his younger sister's gambling debts providing perfect pressure points for coercion that left him no choice but cooperation or watching his sibling die in circumstances that would appear accidental to anyone not familiar with Chinese syndicate methods. His apparent inability to speak Chinese or understand complex Japanese conversations had been carefully cultivated fiction, academic training hidden behind deliberate displays of ignorance that deflected suspicion while providing perfect intelligence-gathering cover. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable, communication logs showing months of systematic information transfer that corresponded exactly with Wei Chen's escalating ability to counter Yamamoto-kai operations through superior intelligence and strategic positioning. Takashi's confession came with detailed explanation of recruitment methods, handler protocols, and assignment requirements that had led to his betrayal of people he considered family, because refusing cooperation would have resulted in his sister's murder followed by his own elimination for knowing too much about Chinese operational methods. Kenji's relief at discovering Aria's innocence was complicated by recognition of how completely his suspicions had poisoned their relationship, creating wounds that might never heal despite evidence that proved her loyalty beyond question. The investigation had revealed not just her innocence, but the extent to which she had been integrated into organizational operations, trusted with information that could destroy everything he had built if she chose to use it against him. Her access to sensitive intelligence far exceeded what any potential spy could have hoped to achieve, making her either the most successful infiltration agent in criminal history or someone whose loyalty was absolute despite being subjected to humiliating investigation. Before personal reconciliation could begin, the immediate threat required resolution through methods that would ensure Wei Chen never again attempted to infiltrate Yamamoto-kai operations. The Chinese leader's intelligence advantage was about to become fatal liability as Qinji planned response that would eliminate not just current threats, but future capacity for similar operations. The battle for organizational survival would be fought with weapons that Wei Chun had provided through his own intelligence gathering, turned against him with precision that demonstrated why underestimating Yamamoto-kai capabilities was always a fatal mistake. The coordinated attack came 48 hours after Takashi's confession, Wei Chen's operatives using stolen intelligence to attempt simultaneous strikes against compound security systems, legitimate business fronts, and family members of key organizational personnel. The assault was comprehensive and well-planned, demonstrating exactly how much damage stolen information could enable when used by people who understood both operational vulnerabilities and cultural pressure points that could destroy morale, even if physical attacks failed to achieve tactical objectives. But Wei Chen's intelligence was several days old, and Qinji had used that time gap to implement security modifications that turned expected advantages into deadly traps for attackers who believed they understood compound defenses and response protocols. Communication intercepts had provided detailed knowledge of assault plans, allowing defensive preparations that channeled attacking forces into killing zones where superior firepower and tactical positioning eliminated threats with efficiency that shocked even veteran security personnel. During the attack, Aria's response definitively proved her loyalty while demonstrating capabilities that exceeded even Qinji's understanding of her training and character. When communication systems were sabotaged by infiltrators who had penetrated outer perimeter defenses, she coordinated defensive efforts through perfect Japanese that maintained operational effectiveness despite electronic jamming and equipment failures. Her quick thinking and precise translations relayed complex tactical instructions between security teams, preventing coordination breakdowns that could have resulted in friendly fire casualties or tactical failures that might have allowed attackers to breach inner compound defenses. More importantly, she chose to remain in the most dangerous location rather than evacuating to secure areas, insisting that communication coordination was more essential than personal safety during crisis that threatened everyone she had come to care about during months of building relationships within the organization. Her courage under fire revealed character that no amount of intelligence training could have simulated, genuine concern for people whose safety mattered more to her than self-preservation. The decisive moment came when Arya intercepted communications indicating that Wei Chen's reserve forces were preparing to target her grandmother's senior community, using the elderly woman as leverage to force Arya's cooperation with demands that would compromise compound security during the ongoing assault. Her warning allowed Qinji to dispatch protection teams while reinforcing her position as someone whose loyalties were completely aligned with organizational interests rather than personal survival or external obligations that could be exploited by enemy operatives. Qinji's response to the attack was characteristically thorough and permanent, coordinated strikes that eliminated Wei Chen's operational capacity while demonstrating why challenging Yamamoto-kai territorial authority was always fatal miscalculation. The Chinese leader's organization was dismantled through precision operations that removed key personnel while destroying infrastructure necessary for future territorial expansion, ensuring that similar threats would never again emerge from that particular source of competition. When the compound security was finally restored and casualty assessments completed, Qinji found himself facing emotional reckoning that was more challenging than tactical problems solved through strategic planning and superior firepower. His suspicions had wounded someone whose loyalty and character deserved better treatment, while his failure to trust his own judgment about her nature revealed weaknesses in his emotional intelligence that could have destroyed the most important relationship in his adult life. The apology came in the same traditional room where he had accused her of betrayal, his words carrying emotional weight that transformed formal Japanese into personal confession of error and regret that went beyond simple acknowledgement of investigative mistakes. He had been wrong about her nature, wrong about her motivations, and wrong about his ability to recognize genuine loyalty, when it was demonstrated through actions rather than declarations. His fear of vulnerability had nearly destroyed the connection that made his isolation in America bearable, proving that emotional cowardice could be more dangerous than physical threats from criminal rivals. Aria's response revealed depths of understanding that humbled him, while demonstrating why their connection transcended simple professional relationships or cultural compatibility. She had been hurt by his suspicions, but not surprised by them. Recognizing that survival in his world required paranoia that could destroy personal relationships if external pressures became severe enough to override emotional judgment. Her forgiveness came with conditions that established boundaries necessary for rebuilding trust, requirements that he demonstrate faith in her loyalty through actions rather than words that could be contradicted by future behavior under stress. The emotional breakthrough that followed was more profound than physical intimacy. Recognition that they had survived testing that revealed the true nature of their commitment to each other. Kenji's walls came down completely as he admitted that losing her would have been worse than losing his organization or his life, while Aria acknowledged that staying to defend people she cared about had been the easiest decision she had ever made despite representing maximum personal risk during crisis that could have killed everyone in the compound. Their relationship had been tested by circumstances that destroyed most partnerships built on convenience or mutual benefit, but their connection was based on something deeper than professional utility or cultural compatibility. They understood each other in ways that transcended language and cultural differences, providing emotional support that neither had found elsewhere despite years of searching for acceptance and understanding that seemed impossible to achieve in a world that valued power over authenticity. As dawn approached and security assessments confirmed that immediate threats had been eliminated, both Kenji and Aria recognized that their partnership had survived challenges that would have broken weaker foundations. Trust had been damaged and rebuilt stronger than before, while loyalty had been tested and proven through actions that demonstrated character rather than simple declarations that could be abandoned when circumstances became difficult. The compound's enhanced security would protect them from external threats, but the emotional bond they had forged through shared vulnerability and mutual understanding provided protection against isolation and cultural displacement that had haunted both their lives before finding each other. What had begun as employment arrangement had evolved into partnership that served needs neither had fully recognized until circumstances forced them to confront exactly how much they meant to each other. Wei Chen's elimination had removed immediate threats while demonstrating that challenging their relationship would always prove a fatal mistake for enemies who underestimated the strength of connection built on genuine cultural understanding and emotional authenticity. Their love had been tested by suspicion and proven through loyalty that transcended personal safety or professional convenience, creating foundation strong enough to support whatever challenges their dangerous world might present in the future. 6 months after Wei Chen's organization had been permanently eliminated and the compound's security restored to levels that ensured no future infiltration attempts would succeed, Kenji Nakamura found himself experiencing emotions he had forgotten were possible during 20 years of cultural isolation and emotional imprisonment. The threat that had tested their relationship beyond breaking point was now history, but the connection that survived that testing had transformed into something deeper and more essential than professional partnership or cultural compatibility. Aria Mitchell moved through the compound with confidence that reflected complete integration into an environment that had initially felt foreign despite its careful attention to cultural authenticity and aesthetic harmony. Her role had expanded beyond translation and cultural consultation to encompass strategic planning for legitimate business expansion that would establish Yamamoto-kai as a model for East-West cooperation rather than simply another criminal organization operating in American territory through intimidation and violence. The morning found them in Kenji's private garden, a space designed according to classical principles that created harmony between natural elements and human intention. Cherry trees imported from Japan provided seasonal beauty that connected the Los Angeles compound to heritage and traditions that shaped identity despite geographical displacement, while carefully arranged stones and flowing water created atmosphere conducive to meditation and contemplation that had become essential to both their daily routines. Kenji prepared tea with the ritual precision that had characterized their relationship from its earliest stages, his movements flowing with meditative focus that transformed simple beverage preparation into cultural ceremony that honored tradition while creating intimate space for conversation that went beyond immediate business requirements. The expensive porcelain cups had been wedding gifts to his grandparents, family treasures that survived wartime destruction and generational displacement to find new purpose in this carefully constructed sanctuary. As steam rose from freshly brewed tea that carried the subtle flavors of high-altitude growing regions where leaves were harvested according to methods unchanged for centuries, Kenji began speaking in Japanese that revealed the full extent of his emotional transformation over months of building trust and understanding with someone who heard not just his words, but their deepest meanings. His voice carried warmth and openness that had been impossible during years of communicating through translators who reduced complex thoughts to simplified approximations. The conversation that morning touched on subjects they had explored before, but with new depth that reflected how crisis had stripped away protective barriers and professional formality that had initially defined their interactions. Kenji spoke about cultural preservation not as abstract concept, but as lived experience of someone who had almost lost connection to heritage that defined identity and provided meaning beyond material success or territorial control. Aria's presence had restored that connection while creating new possibilities for sharing cultural knowledge with people capable of appreciating its value. For Aria, the transformation was equally profound but expressed through growing confidence in abilities that had been undervalued and underutilized during years of financial struggle that forced her to waste education and training on survival jobs that provided income, but no intellectual stimulation. Her linguistic skills now served purposes that prevented conflict while facilitating understanding between cultures that had historically viewed each other with suspicion based on ignorance rather than experience of actual interaction and cooperation. The business expansion they were planning represented more than simple diversification of revenue sources or legitimization of operations that had previously required careful attention to legal boundaries and law enforcement surveillance. Their work was creating new models for international cooperation that honored cultural differences while building economic relationships beneficial to all parties rather than exploitative arrangements that enriched one side while impoverishing others through systematic disadvantage and unequal access to opportunities. As their conversation deepened into territories that had nothing to do with immediate business requirements, Kenji found himself speaking about future possibilities in language that carried emotional weight he had never been able to express during decades of feeling disconnected from his own thoughts and desires. The Japanese poetry forms he used were classical structures that required deep cultural knowledge to understand fully, but they allowed for expression of complex emotions that could not be conveyed through simple declarative statements or business terminology. His words painted pictures of shared life that honored both their backgrounds while creating new traditions that would serve children and grandchildren who would grow up bilingual and bicultural, comfortable in both American and Japanese contexts while contributing to society in ways that built bridges rather than reinforcing divisions between communities. The vision he described was ambitious but grounded in realistic assessment of their combined capabilities and resources, future that seemed achievable rather than merely aspirational. Aria's response came in equally sophisticated Japanese that demonstrated how completely she had absorbed not just language, but cultural values and aesthetic principles that shaped how thoughts were organized and expressed. Her words carried the formal beauty of classical poetry while remaining grounded in practical considerations that showed she understood exactly what he was proposing and what such commitments would require from both participants over decades of shared life and mutual support. The moment when casual conversation transformed into something more binding and permanent arrived, without dramatic announcement or ceremonial preparation. Recognition that their partnership had evolved beyond professional necessity into emotional connection that demanded acknowledgement and formalization. Kenji's voice carried new intensity as he spoke words that translated roughly as "you are mine," but carried cultural weight that encompassed ideas of belonging, responsibility, protection, and devotion that English could never fully capture. The formal possession statement in Japanese was not demand or assertion, but recognition of reality that had been building for months through shared experiences that revealed how completely their lives had become intertwined. Anata wa watashi no mano, he said with quiet certainty that left no room for doubt or negotiation. The words carrying implications that extended far beyond simple romantic attachment to encompass cultural and spiritual union that would transcend individual identity while enhancing rather than diminishing each person's essential nature. Aria's acceptance came in Japanese that was equally formal and binding, her words acknowledging not just personal commitment, but willingness to become part of his world and culture while maintaining her own identity and heritage. Watashi mo anata no mano, she replied with voice that carried both surrender and strength, recognition that belonging to each other would require mutual sacrifice, while providing security and understanding that neither could achieve independently. The physical intimacy that followed was expressed through cultural metaphors that honored both their backgrounds while avoiding explicit description that would have diminished the emotional and spiritual significance of their union. Their connection was described in terms of seasonal changes that brought beauty and renewal, of rivers joining to create stronger currents that could carry both toward destinations that would have been impossible to reach separately. When Kenji spoke of marriage, his proposal honored both Japanese and American traditions while creating new ceremonies that would reflect their unique circumstances and combined heritage. The legal requirements would be satisfied through American law, but the spiritual union would be blessed according to Japanese customs that connected their relationship to centuries of cultural wisdom about building partnerships that could survive challenges and hardship while providing foundation for future generations. The discussion of practical arrangements revealed how completely their separate lives had become integrated into shared existence that served both individual needs and collective goals that went beyond personal happiness to encompass cultural preservation and community building. Aria's grandmother would be moved to specially designed quarters within the compound, where traditional American and Japanese medical approaches could be combined to provide optimal care while allowing the elderly woman to maintain independence and dignity during her final years. The business transformation they envisioned would establish new standards for international cooperation, legitimate enterprises that demonstrated how cultural differences could become competitive advantages rather than sources of conflict and misunderstanding. Their combined expertise in language, culture, and business strategy would create opportunities for other organizations seeking to build bridges between East and West through mutual respect rather than dominance and exploitation. As they planned their wedding, which would take place in the traditional garden where they had shared so many conversations that built understanding and trust, both recognized that their union represented more than personal happiness or romantic fulfillment. Their marriage would symbolize possibility of connection across cultural boundaries that had historically been maintained through ignorance and prejudice rather than genuine differences in values or goals that prevented cooperation and mutual benefit. The ceremony planning occupied weeks of detailed attention to cultural protocols that would honor both their backgrounds while creating new traditions appropriate to their unique circumstances and shared vision for future that served larger purposes than individual satisfaction. Elements from both cultures were woven together with careful attention to meaning and significance, creating celebration that would strengthen rather than diminish their connection to heritage and community. 6 months later, as summer approached and cherry trees prepared for new flowering that would mark another cycle of beauty and renewal, Aria found herself standing before a conference room filled with American business leaders who had come to learn about Japanese cultural approaches to building long-term business relationships based on trust rather than quarterly profits and competitive advantage pursued at any cost to partners or community welfare. Her presentation combined academic knowledge with practical experience gained through months of facilitating negotiations that created value for all participants rather than zero-sum competitions where one side's gain required another's loss. The audience listened with respectful attention as she explained how cultural understanding could prevent misunderstandings that escalated into expensive conflicts while identifying opportunities that remained invisible to people who approached international business through assumption that all markets operated according to American principles and expectations. Kenji watched from the back of the room with pride that had nothing to do with possession or control, but everything to do with witnessing someone he loved using abilities that had been undervalued and wasted before finding an environment where expertise was recognized and appreciated. Her confidence and competence commanded respect from people who initially questioned whether young African-American woman could possibly understand Japanese business culture well enough to provide advice worth expensive consulting fees. The transformation was complete in ways that exceeded either of their original expectations when they first recognized possibility of partnership built on mutual understanding and cultural exchange. Kenji was no longer the isolated figure conducting business through inadequate translators who reduced complex thoughts to simplified approximations that missed essential meanings and cultural context. Arya was no longer underemployed graduate struggling to survive on tips and hourly wages while watching expensive education gather dust because relevant opportunities seemed permanently beyond reach. Their love had created space for individual growth that enhanced rather than diminished their partnership, each person becoming more fully themselves through relationship that honored difference while building unity based on shared values and complementary strengths. The compound had evolved from sanctuary against external threats into community that demonstrated how cultural preservation could serve integration rather than isolation, maintaining heritage while building bridges that served larger purposes than ethnic pride or defensive positioning. As evening approached, and the business presentation concluded with enthusiastic response from audience members who had gained new appreciation for cultural complexity and its practical applications, Arya joined Kenji in the traditional garden where their relationship had deepened through countless conversations that revealed how much they had to offer each other beyond professional utility or romantic attraction. The cherry trees were in full bloom, their delicate flowers creating canopy of beauty that connected Los Angeles compound to landscapes and seasons that had inspired Japanese poets for over 1,000 years. The sight reminded both of them how far they had traveled from their initial meeting in a restaurant where loneliness and professional necessity had brought together two people whose lives were transformed through discovering someone capable of genuine understanding and acceptance. Kenji spoke in Japanese that carried satisfaction and gratitude for connection that had exceeded his wildest hopes during years of feeling lost in translation and culturally displaced despite material success that provided everything except the understanding that made life meaningful. "You saved me from isolation that was destroying my spirit," he told her with quiet intensity that made words feel inadequate for emotions that deserved poetry or music to capture their depth and significance. Arya's response acknowledged how much she had gained through relationship that rescued her from poverty, while providing opportunities to use abilities she had feared would remain forever undervalued in society that often treated linguistic expertise as exotic hobby rather than professional qualification worthy of respect and appropriate compensation. "You gave me purpose and belonging that I never imagined possible," she replied in Japanese that carried gratitude for transformation that exceeded any fairy tale or romantic fantasy she had entertained during years of struggle and delayed dreams. Their final exchange as the story concluded was conducted in silence that spoke more eloquently than words could express, recognition that they had found in each other what years of searching had failed to provide through any other relationship or achievement. Understanding that transcended language barriers, acceptance that honored individual identity while building partnerships stronger than either could achieve independently. Love that served larger purposes than personal happiness, while providing foundation for future that would benefit not just themselves, but communities they served through work that built bridges rather than reinforcing divisions. The compound's lights came on as darkness approached, creating atmosphere of security and beauty that reflected how their lives had been transformed through connection that began with professional necessity, but evolved into something deeper and more lasting than either had believed possible during years of isolation and cultural displacement. Two languages, two cultures, two people who had found in each other the understanding and acceptance that made life worth living beyond simple survival or material accumulation. Kenji Nakamura was no longer alone, no longer lost in translation, no longer trapped behind barriers that money could not break down. For the first time in 20 years, he was truly understood by someone who heard not just his words, but their deepest meanings, someone who shared his commitment to preserving heritage while building future that honored the past without being imprisoned by it. In finding Arya, he had found himself, and in understanding him, she had discovered purpose and belonging that transformed struggle into strength and linguistic skills into bridges that connected worlds previously separated by ignorance and fear. Their love story continued beyond the final scene, written in languages that transcended words through actions that served purposes greater than individual happiness, while providing foundation for connection that would endure whatever challenges their dangerous but increasingly legitimate world might present in years to come. Understanding had triumphed over isolation, love had conquered fear, and two people from different worlds had created something new and beautiful that honored both their backgrounds while pointing toward future possibilities that neither could have imagined achieving alone.